Hello, Dr. Ricardo Grilo, and welcome to PhD Hard Talk. Thank you so much for wanting to have a conversation with me and the audience at home. Could you please introduce yourself, your research, university, and what you're up to now?
Yes, of course. Hi, everyone. And thank you once again for the invitation, first of all. My name is Ricardo Grilo. I did my PhD in a Portuguese university. It is the University of Aveiro. And the PhD is about brand activism and allyship in a very specific context and conversation that is about the LGBT conversation specifically.
Thank you so much. So, I've got some questions that relate to marketing and branding, and we'll also talk about the LGBTQ plus element. But I think most people have an understanding of what they think branding is and what marketing is, but there's no, in activism, literally, they don't gauge in terms of how complex it can be. Essentially for businesses and also for individuals if they're influencers. So we'll go through that. The first question is, what is the difference between marketing and branding? Which is basic.
Yeah, that's a really that's a really nice question and a very important one, because honestly, when we start talking about branding and activism, what we realize is that even people that are studying both concepts a long time ago, we don't have a clear understanding for both. Like we have different opinions, different experience, so it's like kind of tricky to define them. But what I would say is that branding, it's more about making a brand, creating a brand that is cool or something that we want, that is perceived by the consumer. So for example, when we think about brands like Mercedes, for example, or Levi, it's what are the feelings that those brands are communicating. For example, what are the associations that we have when we think about those brands? So branding, it's about creating assets, and normally they are not very clear ones. We are more talking about subjective things. And when we talk about marketing, is promoting this. So we want to promote the brand. We want to communicate the brand. So branding is more about creating something, and marketing, it's more about creating awareness about the brand. It's like the communication of the brand.
Okay, so I'm going to throw a question out there. So I was scrolling through TikTok as you do, and an influencer from the US will write his details because I forgot his name. And basically, what he said was marketing is not actually what we think it is. He said marketing is collecting data. And
Yeah.
he said, that's it. There's nothing more, there's nothing extra. Would you agree with that statement?
Kind of. you know that that is very clear when we think about digital marketing. So digital marketing, it's about data, and it's about personal data. That's why our names, our locations, our tastes, our behaviors, they are so important, and they are so valuable currently. But it's more about digital marketing. When we think about marketing as an overall, and like as a discipline, I would say it's also about data, but it's more than that. It's also consumer behavior. It's also about market, business, strategy. So yeah, of course that we can do better marketing with data, and it's all about that currently, but it's more than that, I would say.
No, I love your response because you've said, yes, it is. However, there's also little nuances that come into it. So that might be the foundation if you're doing it, let's say, on the Tinternet. But however, there's other ways of doing marketing, and it's not just limited to the Tinternet, essentially. I call it the Tinternet.
Exactly.
Yeah, I need to say the internet. There you go, people at home. And so if we move on to brand activism, then you've explained what branding is. What is brand activism?
Yeah. So what happens is, normally when we think about brand activism, we also need to think about brand allyship. But we are talking about concepts that they are quite young. They have like 1 decade probably. And talking about brand activism is when brands decide to take a stand about something. And normally, brand activism is connected with social movements, for example. And here we have a lot. If we go to the digital ecosystem, we can talk about movements like Me Too, Black Lives Matter, more related with environment. So a lot of movements where brands can take a stand, and we need to see if this is brand activism, brand allyship, or other thing, for example. But it's mostly with social movements. It might be, or it might have like political roots, and that's why sometimes brand activism is so scary, because having political stance, it's of course dangerous for brands or companies. So brand activism is like doing branding, using marketing, and taking stance about something. But sometimes it's more than stance. So it's not enough to say I stand with this movement. Is I am doing something about this. Because if you just stand, you are probably an ally. If you want to be an activist, and if we think about people as activists, normally they are in danger, right? Their lives are in danger. It depends, of course, of the context and of the country, but it's always a life issue. So it's like, I don't mind to risk some business because of the values that I stand for, something like this.
That's quite interesting, and that links in nicely with your thesis, essentially, which looks at the LGBTQ plus community. Now, I'm going to move us on to the Olympics because this has just happened and it's quite fresh. So there's been a bit of backlash from different groups about the Olympics. So they've taken a stand and said, we are inclusive and we're very diverse in terms of sports and people, in terms of this community. So therefore, we want to show that through the opening ceremony and the closing ceremony, link it to fashion, music, etc. This is what we stand with. They've had Snoop Dogg doing his thing, It's been exciting, but there's been pushback in terms of religion, whereby they've said, no, don't do that. That's not right. So in this instance, is that alliance or is it activism? What is it?
It might be both, and it might be none of them. So, it's very difficult because, for example, brand activism and brand allyship, normally we have to think also about corporate social responsibility, for example. They are very connected. So it's to think about, and sports industry, it's a very good industry to talk about and to study about it. Because if a brand takes a stand, I would say it might be brand allyship. And then if you have backlash and the brand continues, doesn't step back, for example, we might be talking about brand activism, but it depends. So we need to see the track of the brand or the company. So imagine it's like normally we say we need to understand what has the brand been doing in the last couple of years or months. So if it's just something for the Olympics, that's not enough to say that's brand activism. If it's very like specific at that time. But imagine that it is a brand that has 30 years record working regarding a specific cause, like the LGBTQ plus community. Then we can talk probably about brand activism. But if it's very specific, it just happened on that time, it's not enough to be seen as brand activism.
That is quite interesting because I think previously when we spoke about this topic, you did say that brands, they will dip into Black Lives Matter, we're doing this movement, and then they'll dip into it's LGBTQ plus, dip into that, it's Women's Month, dip into that. So then it becomes very confusing. And I think the way you've explained it about the Olympics, that it might be, it might not be, we actually don't know. It might be a new phenomenon. Who knows? That's a research paper.
Exactly. It's more
But
for what we have to think is if we are only celebrating a specific date and that's it, that's all we do, that's for sure, that's not brand activism, for sure. You know, and it's normally when people say that is pink washing, rainbow washing, green washing, it's when you just celebrate one date, one day, and then you go silent. So that's it's like tricky to say what is brand activism, but it's very easy to say what it's not brand activism.
moves on nicely to one of your subheadings in your thesis is pride for sale.
Right.
So then is the Olympics selling pride for their own benefit to get us to tune in and to talk? Because if you look at social media, that's all that we talked about. I mean, there's wars and all sorts going on around the world, but the main focus became the image, you know, that they shown on the Olympics, and that was the main focus. There were other things that were happening.
Yeah.
Great, amazing things. I mean, the UK, we won a few medals.
Yeah.
Go on. So what are your thoughts then? Going back to your subheading, which is pride for sale?
My answer is yes, it is. So as soon as we have brands and companies with interests to join Pride, for example, it's normal that Pride will be for sale. Because normally when brands join, they have, of course, business goals. And it's okay with that. I think it's not an issue. It's a brand, it's a company, a private one. So they want to have financial gains. They want to make money, and that's it. It's not an issue. And so what they are going to do is, for example, doing merchandise about Pride, and they want to have revenue from that. So yes, it is, but that's not a problem. You know, the thing is how are brands using Pride to help the community. So imagine if you are selling a jacket about Pride, or notebooks or whatever you want to sell with a pride flag, but the money that you are making, it's only for the company. So you are not donating that, you are not using that to increase the resources for internal groups. Then it's like it's not only selling pride, it's like money laundering. You know, it's like using a movement to make money, and that's a problem. But if you use the movement to make money, and then the money that you make, you are using it to help the community or to help the movement, that's okay. That's not an issue, I would say.
You've made a really interesting point, which is that's money laundering. That is a really heavy or hefty statement.
Yeah.
And it links into the next question, which I was going to ask you in terms of is pride for sale, the ethics behind it. So who actually governs as to whether I'm money laundering when it comes to the LGBTQ
Yeah.
plus community? Who tells me? Because I don't think I've seen any policymakers say, look at us over here, you know, follow these guidelines. This is what you should and should not do. Or the Black Lives Matter movement or the We movement, who actually governs that? Because I'm sure you've seen the scandals behind the Black Lives Matter, which shocked a lot of people globally. So, what are your thoughts on that in terms of governance and
Yes, I
ethics?
would say that when we talk about social movements and their connection with brands and companies, normally, and something that we explain in the thesis, it's the idea of authenticity and legitimacy, and who keeps the legitimacy for specific movements. And for the LGBTQ plus community, what I would say is that we have a lot of people, a lot of activists, a lot of associations that they might be like the gatekeepers for the legitimacy for that specific market. So it's like if a company or if a brand is working with a community, for example, with people that belong to that community, with associations that work with that community, then they are probably the ones that can help with this governance. and that can help the brands showing that they are doing in an authentic way, you know. So it's like they are working with third-party providers almost. It's not something that is happening inside the company only, and it's like it's something like the job starts inside and goes outside and never in the other direction. So it's never from the outside to the inside, you know. And then of course you have the consumer. So if we are talking about brands and companies, probably we have the stakeholders also, and the consumer is probably one of the most important stakeholders. So it's like we have associations, we have the community itself, we have consumers, we have shareholders. All of them belong to this idea of governance that are important to make sure that the company is accountable for the decisions that they make.
So I have a question. When it comes to influencers on social media, is that the same? Because let's say we'll take brands like Mac, right? Tilly, I think it's Tilly Tilbury, and they work with influencers. But when we get to like months like Pride Month or Christmas, you will see the diversity and inclusion in terms of the LGBTQ plus community and also people of color, all the brown tones, right? Because we want to sell. But then maybe the first 6 months of the year, the 8 months, it's not really, it's not there. It's not happening. So then the question I have, it goes back to those influencers, because obviously we all want a bit of cheddar. I need to pay my bills, right? I've got university. So if you're giving me money, why not? Right? But then where are my ethics and governance? Where does that come in when it comes to influencers? Because other influencers as well, I don't know if you've seen, they will jump on a bandwagon to say this is trending. Let me jump on it. It works, it sells. But then when people then say, I'll give you an example. I won't mention the influencer's name because they might sue me and I don't have the cheddar. But basically, people then said, oh, are you a part of the LGBTQ plus community? He said, no, I'm a cis man. But then people are like, your behaviors, you are leading us to believe that you're a part of this community. He goes, no, that's not true. So then I then asked the question to say, how do we govern that? Because I too believed that initially, just assuming until he said that. And then I said, well, that's a bit confusing because you've actually made the brand of you in terms of who you are based off of that. So now we're a bit confused.
Yeah, if we think about that in the perspective of branding, branding is about that, right? Create a specific image. That it might be true or not, but it's the image that we want people to create, right? And we can, as a brand, I can even create an image and you can see the brand in a totally different perspective. So I don't have a way to make sure that the images that I want to share is the image that you will create about the brand, right? So it's a very complex thing, I would say, from a branding perspective. From the perspective of influencer marketing, for example, it's like one, and we talked about this with a lot of influencers for the thesis from different countries, and I would say that it depends of how demanding influencers are with the brands. So, for example, we discussed with a few influencers that they said that they won't accept working with the brands if they don't have a clear idea of what they want to do. So the topic of the campaign, the budget, the goals, like why are you doing this? And they were saying that of course they need to pay the bills. However, they also want to make sure they are very worried about their image. So they have a lot of questions and they almost demand all the answers they need to the brands to make a decision. And on the other side, we have influencers that they are not so demanding with the brands. So of course that we as consumer, we might be sensitive to this and trying to understand. but honestly, it's very complex. It's exactly the same for the brands, right? We can have an opinion about the brand,
Mhm.
and then we realize that it's not close of the reality, right? So
Mm.
it's always very, very hard. And with social media, it's even harder to understand. That's for sure.
No, I agree. So I'll move into another interview that's just happened recently, and it was Ray J and Candice Owens.
Mhm.
And Candice asked a specific question. What is the difference between a trans woman and a woman? And I don't know if you've seen the interview, but it was just a game of cheese and mouse.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
essentially. And, it moves me on to the next question, which is consumer backlash, which you've discussed in your thesis.
yeah,
What is that? And why should businesses be aware of that now that they know what branding is? And you've explained it
yeah.
perfectly well, and influencers as well. And in terms of what is it, how does it work, and why should we avoid it?
Of course. So one of the things that we need first to realize is that when I was studying the brand that we selected for the thesis,
Mhm,
I discovered like a lot of things that brands were doing
mhm,
related with the community that we were studying that I didn't know. So, which is very important for us to understand that sometimes if we really want to understand what the brand is doing to see if they are authentic or not, we need to study about it,
mhm,
right? We almost need to be like doing research about the brand because you might have information all over the place
mhm,
and sometimes I was really surprised with a lot of things that brands were doing, which is really, really good. But when we look from the other for the other side and go into your question, the issue here that I would say is that backlash is normally the negative response from the consumer to your campaign, normally. So, for example, you are saying, and this happened with one of the brands, it was like okay, we celebrate pride, right? And love is love. We are all equal. Celebrate love. And then you have pride flags during June in your social media. And
mhm,
you have a lot of consumers saying, we won't buy this brand anymore. Please stop doing that. It's not your job. Um, and normally it's more about comments on social media.
mhm,
And so what brands need to be prepared before doing this kind of campaigns is if they are prepared to face this negative, these bad comments first of all, and how to
mhm,
react to them, for example. And one of the things, and there's a few studies about this already, and we name some of them, where they say that as more clear and bold you are in your comments, the
mhm,
better. So if someone says, please stop celebrating this, this is not for brands. And if the brand says, but this is what we believe in,
mhm,
so we understand your opinion, but this is our positioning, it's better than just ignore it or delete
mhm,
the comments. So it's like, but to do this, the brand, when she's creating the campaign, needs to define almost what she's going to do if the campaign generates backlash. That's important to have this plan, I would say.
mhm.
It's quite
That
normal.
that
When we
yeah.
talk about this kind of topics, it's very normal to have negative um, responses to the campaigns. So